The night Stellan Vore married a woman nobody respected, every crime family in the Midwest started paying attention. They looked at Nora Voss standing beside him in the cold lakeside wind, and they saw the end of something. A liability in a dress that cost more than most men in that room made in a month. They whispered. They calculated. They made plans. None of them asked the right question. Not why did Stellan Vore marry her, but what did he see that they couldn't? 3 seconds. That is all you get before we go back to the beginning. 3 seconds of a woman standing alone in a mountain compound. The lights cut to nothing. The wind pressing hard against the walls, and her hands completely still at her sides. Not frozen, not afraid. Still the way a person is still when they have already made every decision that matters and are simply waiting for the world to catch up. Then we go back 11 months to a Tuesday morning in October, to a glazed donut and a spreadsheet that was about to change everything. The offices of Hargrove and Sec Forensic Consulting occupied the 14th floor of a glass tower on Wacker Drive, and on the morning everything changed. Nora Voss was eating a glazed donut over a keyboard and running a financial reconciliation that her supervising partner considered too routine to assign to anyone who actually mattered. She was 34 years old. She had been doing this work for 11 years. She had the kind of face that people forgot in meetings and remembered afterward when the numbers came back different from what they expected. She was not what the world had decided she was. The world had not yet been corrected on this point. The assignment had come through a third-party procurement firm, a routine financial review for a hospitality group called Lakeshore Premier Holdings, which owned 14 restaurants, 3 hotels, and a dry cleaning chain that somehow posted $1 million in quarterly profit, despite vacancy rates that would make a Vegas accountant sweat. Her partner had handed it over with the casual indifference of a man who considered it a garbage job. Rubber-stamped the numbers, invoiced them Friday. He had given it to her because she was the best at finding nothing worth finding. He had miscalculated. Nora took the last bite of the donut brush powdered sugar off her keyboard with the back of her wrist and stared at a transaction code she had seen 3 times across 4 supposedly unrelated subsidiaries. The amounts were different. The dates were staggered. The routing numbers traced back to a Cayman entity that had been dissolved. Re-registered, dissolved again, and re-registered under a name. 1 letter different from the original. Whoever built this structure was very good. Not good enough. She opened a fresh spreadsheet and started working backward. 43 minutes later, she had traced $4.2 million cycling through a network of shell companies with the elegance of a money launderer who had done this many times and trusted that no one on the other end had the patience or the skill to follow the thread. The construction was beautiful. She could appreciate the architecture even while pulling it apart. Someone had spent real time designing this. They had never met Nora Voss. She printed the summary, clipped it to the primary audit report, and took it to her supervising partner's office. His name was Harlan Sec, and he went pale so fast she thought he might pass out. He looked at the spreadsheet summary. He looked at the door behind her. Then something complicated happened behind his eyes. Fear first, then calculation, then a very specific kind of professional cowardice she had seen before in men who understood exactly what they were looking at and chose deliberately to look away. Nora, this client. "I know who the client is," she said. "Then you understand. I understand that $4.2 million moved through 17 entities in 9 months and ended up in an account that does not officially exist." She kept her voice level. She had practiced keeping her voice level her entire adult life. "I understand that our engagement letter requires us to report material financial irregularities. This is different." "I know." He closed the folder. He pushed it back across the desk toward her. I need you to go back through your methodology and find where you made an error. She did not pick up the folder. I did not make an error. The silence between them was not comfortable. It had never been comfortable. She was too precise, too consistent, too impossible to redirect when she had found something real. He knew that. He had hired her for it. And now he was sitting across from her wishing he had given this file to someone lazier. You are going to go home, he said finally. You are going to take personal leave starting today. I will handle the client communication. The $4.2 million is not our problem. She picked up the folder. She looked at him for a long moment, a quiet, measuring look that he clearly found unsettling because he shifted in his chair and adjusted his tie, even though it did not need adjusting. Then she nodded once and walked out of his office. She did not go home. She went back to her desk, emailed herself a copy of every document, every reconciliation file, every transaction trace she had built in the last 43 minutes, logged out of the firm's system, packed her bag, and took the elevator down to the lobby. She stopped at the coffee cart in the atrium. The man who ran it put the right amount of foam on her latte without her asking. She stood there with her coffee and her bag and her folder, and she thought about what came next. What came next was the problem. She knew who owned Lakeshore Premier Holdings. The name was not in the public filings. The ownership structure had been designed specifically to prevent that. But she had been doing this work for 11 years, and Chicago's financial underbelly was a small world once you knew where to look. The money cycled back to a man named Stellan Vore, which meant she was standing in a lobby holding documented proof of internal theft from the most feared organized crime operation in the Midwest. She took a sip of her latte. The rational move was obvious. Delete the email, shred the folder, take Harlan's sex advice, and disappear into personal leave until the whole thing was someone else's memory. Nora Voss had never been very good at the rational move. She finished her coffee, threw the cup away, and hailed a cab. The address she had for Vore Holdings' executive offices was a building on Michigan Avenue that looked from the outside like a very ordinary private equity firm. Brushed steel lobby, a security desk staffed by two men who were slightly too large and slightly too still to be ordinary guards, a receptionist whose professional pleasantness had a very precise wall behind it. Nora walked in, set her bag on the security desk, and said she needed to speak with someone about the Lakeshore audit. The larger of the two guards looked at her the way men in that building probably looked at everyone who walked in without an appointment, like an inconvenience to be processed and eliminated. Do you have a meeting? No. Then tell whoever you need to tell that the auditor Hargrove and Sec just tried to bury found $4.2 million missing from the Lakeshore accounts. And the person who found it is standing in your lobby. She sat down on the bench against the wall and pulled out her phone and checked her email. She was genuinely calm. She had examined this in the cab and decided that the fear response she probably should have been having was not as useful as clarity, so she had set it aside. Either they were going to deal with her professionally, or they were not. Either way, she would have her answer. 17 minutes later, the receptionist told her someone would see her. The man she was brought to was not Stellan Vore. He was Stellan Vore's financial director, a tightly wound man in his late 50s, named Aldous Fenn, who sat behind a desk that cost more than her car and looked at her folder the way a surgeon looks at an unexpected test result. Not with panic, with the careful, focused attention of someone who understood immediately what they were seeing and was already calculating its implications. He did not speak for almost 2 full minutes. You work for Hargrove and Sec, he said. I did as of this morning. I am currently on personal leave. She kept her hands folded in her lap. I am not here to negotiate. I am here because whoever stole that money from your organization did it with enough sophistication that your own internal review missed it. And I found it in 43 minutes, which tells me either your internal team is not looking or they are involved. Aldous Fenn looked at her. And you think bringing this here directly is the only logical move? Yes. She met his eyes. If I take it to law enforcement, your organization has a problem, and so do I, because I spend the next 2 years being called as a witness in a federal case. If I bury it the way my partner told me to, I am complicit in covering up a theft, and I have wasted the only leverage I have. If I bring it here and the organization handles it internally. She opened her hands. Problem solved. You get your money back, your security gap gets closed, and nobody outside this room has to know it ever happened. That is a remarkably composed pitch for a woman who just walked into an organized crime firm with evidence of internal theft. I know what kind of firm this is, and that concerns me less than being complicit in burying a fraud I found. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up his phone, turned toward the window, and spoke quietly for approximately 90 seconds. When he came back, he said, "Someone wants to meet you." Stellan Vore was not what she had expected. She had expected the performance, the power suit, the cold eyes, the deliberate stillness of a man accustomed to controlling every room he entered. She had read enough about him to construct a shape from the rumors, and the shape was built from a very specific kind of dread. What she had not expected was someone who listened. He sat across from her in a conference room on the top floor, with no desk between them, no performance of dominance in the chair position or the lighting, just a man in a good charcoal suit reading her summary document, with the focused attention of someone who genuinely understood financial instruments. No aides visible. No bodyguards visible, though she was certain they were close. Aldous Fenn stood near the door and said nothing. Stellan read. He turned pages. He went back to the second page and read something twice. Then he set the folder down and looked at her. His eyes were dark and direct. There was an exhaustion in them she had not anticipated. Not the exhaustion of a tired man, but of a man who had been running something very heavy for a very long time and had grown accustomed to the weight without becoming immune to it. "You found this in 43 minutes, he said, while eating a donut. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, the near ancestor of one. The account, he said. I am assuming you already know whose name it is registered to. I have a theory. I would rather not state it without confirmation. State it anyway." She told him. He did not react with surprise, which confirmed what she already suspected. He had held the same theory himself, possibly for some time, and simply lacked the documented architecture to prove it. What she had given him was not just discovery. It was evidence. "What do you want?" he said. "A fair engagement." She held his eyes. "I want to conduct a full review of your holding structure. All of it. Every subsidiary, every account. Because if one person built this extraction scheme, there is a statistical probability they tested it first in smaller amounts across other entities. And if I find more, I want to be compensated appropriately. You are proposing to audit an organized crime empire. I am proposing to audit a financial network with structural vulnerabilities that someone is currently exploiting. What the network supports operationally is not my department." Stellan Vore looked at her for a long time. The kind of look she had learned to hold without looking away. Because looking away was a performance of weakness she had stopped giving sometime around her 23rd birthday when she decided it had never protected her anyway. "You are not afraid of me," he said. "Should I be? Most people are. Most people do not come here voluntarily with documentation." He almost smiled again. Then he looked at Aldous. Something passed between them she could not read. He looked back at her. Full engagement, he said. Compensation to be negotiated with Aldous. You work directly with me, not through any intermediary. He paused. And Ms. Voss, the name you gave me. You do not discuss that with anyone outside this room. I am a forensic auditor, she said. Discretion is the job. 3 months. 3 months of 16-hour days spent over ledgers and transaction records and offshore account structures that span 6 countries and 4 regulatory jurisdictions. She found 2 more extraction schemes, smaller than the first, and more elegant, almost invisible, and a third attempt that had been abandoned partway through, which told her the person responsible had lost access or gotten nervous. She traced the money. She built the cases. She handed them over in clean, documented packages. She did not ask what actions Stellan took. She did not want to know. What she noticed instead was Stellan himself. He was present in a way she had not expected. Not micromanaging, never questioning her methods or her conclusions, but genuinely engaged, sitting across from her at the conference table 2 or 3 evenings a week, asking questions that revealed he understood the material far better than he led on publicly. He had an economics education buried somewhere under the inherited empire and the performance of the untouchable crime boss. He read her reports the way a man who could have written them reads reports, with the quiet recognition of someone finding a familiar language. They argued. He had strong opinions about the strategic value of certain entities she flagged as structurally dangerous. She had equally strong opinions about the difference between a calculated risk and a liability dressed up as one. They went several rounds before arriving at compromises neither of them was completely satisfied with. She privately thought those were probably the right outcomes. One evening in late November, they were the last 2 people on the floor. The cleaning staff had come and gone. The city below was the particular orange and black of a Chicago night, pushing into winter. And the conference room was lit by the flat white of the overhead lights and the glow of her laptop screen. She had flagged a holding entity in the logistics subsidiary as high risk, and Stellan disagreed, and they had been going at it for 20 minutes with the specific, focused energy of 2 people who were not going to let the other one win easily. Finally, he said, "You are not afraid of being wrong." She considered this. "I am afraid of missing something," she said. "That is different." He looked at her across the table. Not the way he had looked at her in the beginning, with the careful assessment of a man evaluating a professional asset. Something had shifted in the 3 months they had been working together. A recalibration she had noticed and had chosen not to examine too closely, because examining it too closely felt like a distraction from the work, and she did not allow herself distractions from the work. She looked back at her laptop. He did not look away as quickly. 3 months after she walked into that lobby, Stellan Vore asked her to dinner. She said yes, not because she had romantic notions about it. She was pragmatic enough to hold no illusions about what she was or was not to a man like Stellan Vore. She said yes because she was curious about who he was outside the conference room, and curiosity had always been her dominant instinct. The dinner was not what she expected. They talked about financial architecture for the first 20 minutes, and then fell sideways into a conversation about her father that she had not intended to have. He asked her about Montana, and she told him the truth, which was not something she typically did with someone she was not yet sure she trusted. She told him about the compound, about her father's discipline and his obsessions, and the long, cold winters that had shaped her in ways she had spent her adult life trying to account for. She did not tell him everything. She never told anyone everything about that. But she told him enough that he understood she was not the soft woman the world had decided she was. And she watched him recalibrate in real time, the subtle adjustment in his eyes, as the full outline of her came into focus. "You buried it," he said. "Not an accusation. More like recognition. I became a forensic auditor, she said. I make things tidy. I find the hidden things and I put them in order. It is the opposite of— She stopped. Of what your father made you. Of what my father made me. He looked at her across the table, and the exhaustion was still in his eyes. But something else was there too. Something she could not quite name. And she decided that curiosity was a dangerous thing when it operated in the same space as attraction, and she should probably be more careful about both. She was not more careful. 4 weeks later, Stellan Vore proposed, not romantically. She gave him credit for that. He did not attempt to dress it in something it was not. He laid it out plainly, sitting across from her in the same conference room where they had had their very first meeting, which she thought was either tactless or deliberately honest, and she decided to assume the latter. He needed a wife. The empire required appearances, stability, a signal to both allies and enemies that Stellan Vore was grounded, and not the kind of man who could be destabilized by personal disruption. He was 39 and had been putting this off for 7 years, and his inner circle had recently made clear that the delay was creating political problems with the older families who read bachelorhood in a man of his position as either recklessness or weakness. More importantly, he needed someone he trusted with the actual workings of the empire, someone who could sit in rooms and understand what was being said without having it explained, someone whose intelligence he respected. He respected hers. He told her this without decoration. She sat with it for a moment. The practical part of her brain ran the calculation. The arrangement offered security resources and access to the kind of professional challenge she would never find inside a legitimate firm. The part of her that had grown up learning to survive in harsh conditions recognized the strategic clarity of the offer and was not offended by it. The part of her she tried not to listen to too closely noticed that she was being chosen specifically and deliberately by a man who had enough power to choose anyone and had chosen her. She was also 34 years old and had spent her entire adult life being overlooked and underestimated and occasionally openly mocked. And she was not made of stone. "What are the terms?" she said. He had them ready. She spent 2 hours going through the contract with the same precision she brought to any financial instrument, and amended 4 clauses that were either unclear or insufficiently protective. He agreed to all 4 amendments without argument, which told her something about how serious he was. She said, yeah. The wedding was small. 30 guests, a private venue on the lake, a ceremony that lasted 20 minutes and felt like a real thing despite everything which surprised her. She had expected to feel nothing. Standing next to him in the cold lakeside wind, watching his face as the officiant spoke, watching the lines around his eyes and the particular stillness of his hands, she felt something she did not have a name for yet and chose to file away for later examination. The reception lasted 4 hours. The mob wives arrived in clusters perfumed and precise with smiles that went exactly as deep as social obligation required, and no further. She knew them by name and family connection before they introduced themselves, because she had done her research the same way she did with any professional engagement. Thoroughness was not optional. It was baseline. She shook hands and absorbed assessments and said the right things in the right register. After the clusters drifted back to their own conversations, she heard it. Not loudly. These women knew better than to be loud about it. But the whisper circuit in a room like this operated at a frequency she had learned to catch years ago in offices where she was always the last one anyone expected to have the sharpest number in the room. She heard the word mistake. She heard a comment about her dress that was technically a compliment and unmistakably not. She let it go. She had larger calculations to make. What she did not let go was the face of Patrick Dorr standing across the room with a glass of champagne, watching Stellan with an expression that had nothing social in it. Patrick Dorr was 52 years old and had spent 3 decades in the service of Franklin Sayre's family. He had the eyes of a man who was always doing math that had nothing to do with the conversation he was currently in. He looked at Stellan the way people look at something they have already decided to eventually take apart. She filed that too. The first 6 months inside the Vor Empire were professionally the most stimulating of Nora's life. Stellan gave her full access to the legitimate holding structure. Hotels, restaurants, real estate, a logistics company. 3 manufacturing entities. She went through it with the meticulous focus of someone who had been waiting for a project this complex without knowing it. She found inefficiencies, redundancies, tax positions being maintained out of habit rather than strategy, and 3 legitimate revenue streams being run at a fraction of their actual potential because no one had looked at them recently with fresh eyes. She built models. She made recommendations. Stellan read every one of them and implemented most of them and pushed back on a handful with arguments she took seriously, because he was not wrong about all of them. Together in those months, they built something that worked. She did not call it partnership out loud, but she thought it. One evening in the spring, they argued for 40 minutes about a decision he had made regarding a logistics subsidiary acquisition. He had moved quickly on instinct, and the structural underpinning of the deal had a gap she could see from 3 angles. She laid it out. He pushed back. She pushed back harder. The argument had the specific, focused heat of 2 people who both understood exactly what the other was saying and were not prepared to concede the point. Finally, he looked at the model she had built and was quiet for a moment. "You are right," he said. "The gap is real." It was not a performance of humility. It was a man who had just updated his position on the basis of better information and was saying so plainly. She had worked in professional environments for 11 years. She had never once heard those 3 words from a man in authority delivered without qualification or deflection. She thought about that for a long time afterward. At night in the apartment they shared, she and Stellan existed in the same space with a careful practicality that was strangely not uncomfortable. They were not performing intimacy they did not have. What they had was a shared interest in the project they were running together, and a mutual respect that was real rather than diplomatic. And she had decided that was more valuable than most things she had observed people calling love. She knew in the honest and quiet part of herself that she was not being entirely accurate about what it was. She chose for a while not to examine it. The second 6 months were different. She felt it shift sometime in the 8th month. A change in the temperature of certain rooms. A quality of attention directed at her from outside Stellan's immediate circle that had a different texture than simple curiosity about the new wife. She started paying attention to the pattern of it. Who looked and how and when. Patrick Dorr turned up at 2 social functions in October. He was perfectly cordial both times, which was in itself a flag, she noted. And then in October at a charity gala at the Art Institute, the kind of event that existed to perform philanthropic generosity while conducting the actual business of proximity and observation. Sylvia Raft made a comment about Nora's appearance. It was wrapped in enough layers of plausible deniability to be technically unprovable as an insult. The women in the cluster laughed with the specific calibration of people who understood they were permitted to laugh at this. Nora smiled, said something pleasant, excused herself. In the bathroom, standing at the mirror, she ran cold water over her wrists the way she did when she needed to get her pulse down, and she looked at her own reflection and thought about her father's voice, the flat, practical voice he used when teaching her something he considered non-negotiable. You do not get to feel it until after, during you work. She dried her hands. She went back out. She was halfway across the room when she saw it. Patrick's door was near the east window, partially obscured by a cluster of people between them, talking to a man she did not recognize. The conversation lasted perhaps 15 seconds. What passed between them was not a handshake and not a business card. It was a small envelope transferred quickly, pocketed immediately with the practiced economy of a man who had done this kind of exchange many times in many rooms. Nora did not stop walking. She did not change direction. She crossed to the bar, ordered a club soda, and stood with her drink, and watched the room with the same expression she wore at every event, pleasant and observant and giving nothing away. But in the back of her mind, something had just turned on. She had been feeling a wrongness in the architecture of certain communications for weeks, a pattern in the way some meetings were scheduled, and some information was routed that had the feel of deliberate misdirection. She had been building a model of it in her head, without yet having enough pieces to show anyone, including Stellan, because showing someone a half-built case was worse than showing them nothing. The envelope changed the calculation. She did not tell Stellan that night. She did not tell him the following week. She needed more before she had something worth saying. And she had learned from the Lakeshore discovery that the value of information was entirely dependent on its completeness. Half a case was worse than no case. She went home that night and sat at the kitchen table for a long time in the dark. And she thought about Patrick Doerr's hands and the speed of that exchange, and what kind of organization would need to pass documents in rooms full of people who knew exactly who was watching. She thought about Franklin Sayer. She thought about the pattern of misdirection in the communication channels. She thought about the specific quality of Patrick Doerr's eyes at the wedding, watching Stellan the way a person watches something they have already decided to eventually take apart. She thought about the locked case at the back of the closet in the bedroom, the one she had carried from Montana 11 years ago when she left and built a different life over the wreckage of the one her father had constructed for her. She had never opened it in Chicago. She had never been able to quite throw it away. She was not yet sure why she was thinking about it now. She sat in the dark kitchen and listened to the city, and began very quietly to pull threads. 3 weeks she pulled those threads. 3 weeks of working 2 tracks simultaneously. The legitimate financial review that Stellan expected, and the quiet private investigation she was running underneath it, in the margins of her own time, in the early mornings before he was up, and the late nights after he had gone to sleep. She built the model piece by piece the way she built every model, starting with what she could document, and working outward toward what she could only infer. And the shape that emerged from those 3 weeks of careful, methodical work was not a comfortable shape. The communication anomalies were real. Someone inside the organization was rerouting specific categories of operational information through channels that added unnecessary steps. And the unnecessary steps all had one thing in common. They passed through a node she could not fully trace. The financial pattern she had been tracking had the fingerprint of deliberate misdirection, the kind that required both access and patience. And the shell structure she had identified through indirect connections to the Sayer family organization had the architecture of something being built slowly, something designed to be invisible until it was ready to be used. She was 3 weeks from having a complete case when Stellan came home on a Tuesday evening with a particular set to his jaw and sat across from her at the kitchen table and said he needed her to come with him to a compound he owned in the Adirondacks. He had a summit to attend. He needed her somewhere secure while he handled it. She looked at him across the table. "What kind of summit?" she said. "The kind I cannot explain in detail yet." She looked at his face, the specific quality of his stillness, the way his hands were resting flat on the table, with a deliberateness that was not natural to him. She thought about 3 weeks of thread pulling. She thought about Patrick Dorr and the envelope and the particular wrongness she had been mapping in the dark margins of her working days. She thought about a shell structure with indirect connections to Franklin Sayre. She thought about her father's voice. You do not get to feel it until after. All right, she said. She packed her bag. Then she went to the bedroom closet and took the locked case from the back shelf and set it beside the bag. She stood there looking at both of them for a moment. The life she had built for 11 years, and the things she had carried out of Montana and never been able to throw away. She packed them both. They drove north the following morning into the first real snow of the season. The city falling away behind them, and the highway narrowing as the trees thickened on either side, and the sky the particular flat white of a winter that had decided to stop waiting. Stellan drove. She watched the landscape and thought about what she was not yet saying, and how long she could reasonably wait before saying it. By the time they reached the compound, she had made her decision. The Adirondack compound was everything a man like Stellan Vore would build in the mountains. Stone and timber. Security systems built into the architecture so completely that the first-time visitor would mistake them for design choices. A staff that moved with the quiet efficiency of people who had been selected for capability rather than presentation. The head of site security was a man named Hatch Reiser, who shook her hand on arrival with the careful formality of someone who had been told to be respectful, without being told why, and whose eyes did the kind of rapid, quiet assessment she recognized, because she did it herself. She spent 2 days learning the compound, not as a place she was living in, as a problem she was solving. Every room, every exit, every camera position, the generator housing, the utility corridors, the distances between buildings, the angles of sight lines from the upper windows, where the motion sensors were positioned along the tree line, and the specific blind spots in their coverage. Old habit. Her father had started requiring it when she was 10. Every building you enter is either a resource or a trap depending on how well you know it. She had thought at the time that this was paranoia. She now understood it was simply accurate. On the third evening, she and Stellan sat in front of the fire in the main study. The storm that had been threatening all day had not yet arrived, but the wind off the mountain had the particular density of weather that was building toward something. The fire moved in long, unhurried shapes against the stone of the hearth, and the room was warm in the specific way that rooms with good fireplaces in cold climates are warm. A warmth that feels earned rather than manufactured. He reached over without saying anything and put his hand over hers on the armrest of the chair. And neither of them spoke for a while. She had been waiting for the right moment. She had decided during the drive up that the right moment was before he left, not after, because after would be too late to be useful. "There is something I need to tell you," she said. She told him all of it. The communication anomalies, the rerouting pattern, the shell structure with its indirect Sayre connections. 3 weeks of work laid out in the plain, precise language she used when the stakes were high enough. The clarity mattered more than anything else. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he looked at the fire for a long time. "How long?" he said. "Until you had a complete case. 3 more weeks. Maybe less." He was quiet again. "The summit," she said. "Tell me what it actually is." He looked at her, and in his eyes, underneath the control and the calculation and the exhaustion that was always there, was something raw that he did not quite allow himself to express. "It was called through Rourke Dellum's office," he said. "Framed as an emergency session of the Northern Commission." The invitation looked legitimate. He paused. "I have been having the same feeling you were describing, for longer than 3 weeks." She held his gaze. "If it is a trap, I know what it might be." If you go anyway, I have to go. He said it without drama. If I do not show and it is legitimate, the political cost is significant. If I show and it is not, I need to know what Sayre is willing to move. He looked at her directly. And I need you somewhere I know is secure. She thought about what she had built in 3 weeks. She thought about the shape of it. She thought about a man she had watched for 11 months make every hard decision without flinching, and then sit by the fire and put his hand over hers without saying anything, because he did not need to say anything. She thought about the locked case in the bedroom. If you are not back when you should be back, she said, carefully, I need you to know something about me. Something I have not told you. He waited. I am not who they think I am. The women at those events. The people who look at me and see. She stopped. She started again. I have been something else before. Something I buried a long time ago because I needed to live a different life. But I buried it. I did not lose it. He was quiet for a moment. I know, he said. She looked at him. Aldous ran a background check when you first came to us. Standard practice. He paused. Wyoming. Your father. The compound you grew up in. He held her eyes. The training records. She was quiet. I did not ask you about it, he said, because you had the right to decide what to tell me and when. She sat with this. She looked at the fire. She thought about a year of dinners and arguments over financial models and the particular quality of his silences and the hand on hers tonight, and the hand on hers at the kitchen table 3 weeks ago. She thought about the choice she had made in that lobby on Michigan Avenue with a folder and a half-finished latte. The choice that had set every subsequent thing in motion. If you are not back, she said again quietly, they are going to find out very quickly that they have made a catastrophic error in their assessment of this situation. Outside, the wind came harder. The fire moved in its long shapes. Stellan Vore, the most feared man in the Midwest criminal world, looked at his wife at the set of her jaw, and the quality of her stillness and something that might have been relief settled into his face for just a moment before the control came back. I know, he said. I have known for a while. He left the following morning into the storm. The compound settled into its midwinter quiet. Nora worked. She reviewed the final pieces of the financial model she had been building, cross-referencing the shell structure data against 3 weeks of communication anomalies. And the picture that emerged in the last hours of that afternoon had the cold, clarifying quality of a thing that had been almost visible for weeks and had finally resolved into a shape she could name. She was still at the security room desk when the lights went out. Not a gradual dimming, not a flicker. A clean, immediate cut to total darkness that happened at 7:43 in the evening and that lasted exactly the wrong amount of time before the backup generator should have triggered, and did not. She sat in the dark for 4 seconds and listened. The backup generator had its own dedicated circuit. It was designed to activate within 90 seconds of primary power loss, regardless of the cause. The fact that it had not activated meant the failure was not accidental. It meant someone had cut both the primary supply and the failsafe in sequence, which required knowing where both systems were and how they interacted. That kind of knowledge came from either detailed technical access or a recent walkthrough of the facility. Both possibilities arrived in her chest at the same time and settled there like stones. She moved. The bedroom. The locked case. She worked the combination by feel her fingers remembering it across 11 years and 1,000 repetitions in the dark and cold of a Montana compound. The case opened. She loaded the 9mm with the automatic efficiency of someone whose hands had done this below the level of conscious thought and hoped every year since that they would never need to do it again. They did not shake. She noticed this with a distant clinical interest. 11 years of spreadsheets and conference rooms and carefully managed ordinary life, and her hands still remembered. She sheathed the knife at her left hip, pulled the tactical gloves on, left the flashlight in the case. Light was a liability in a structure she already knew by memory. She stood in the dark bedroom and listened to the compound. She had spent 2 days learning the baseline sound of this place, the specific grammar of how it settled in mountain cold, the heating system's particular rhythm, the way sound moved through the stone corridors differently from the timbered rooms. What she was hearing now was that grammar with something wrong inside it. Not louder, subtler, the way silence sounds when something is being careful inside it. Someone was already in the house. She went to the bedroom door, cracked it 2 inches, looked toward the main corridor. The smell reached her before anything visual did. A faint outdoor cold that did not belong inside, the kind that clings to a person who has come in from sub-zero temperatures and has not been inside long enough to lose it. Someone had entered from the east side. The kitchen entrance. Exterior lock with a keypad and no deadbolt back up a gap she had noted on day 1. She moved down the corridor toward the main staircase, heel to toe, weight distributed, staying right against the wall where the treads were solid and did not flex. She moved the way her father had taught her to move through the dark, as if the ground were a conversation she was trying not to interrupt. She was halfway to the staircase landing when she heard a footstep from the direction of the study. Single. Then nothing. The pause had the specific quality of someone very good at what they were doing who had stopped because their protocol required it. She flattened against the wall and brought her breathing down to almost nothing. 30 seconds. A minute. Then a voice, low and controlled, speaking in the direction of someone she could not see. East corridor, clear, moving to main. The accent was flat Midwestern with a professional edge, not mob muscle. Trained. Military or law enforcement background. External contractors. Hired through channels designed to insulate whoever had ordered this from whoever was executing it. Franklin Sayre had been thorough. She heard a second set of footsteps from the direction of the kitchen, moving toward the study, and understood the sweep pattern. 2 visible moving in converging arcs, which meant there was almost certainly a third position she had not yet located. The one she could not hear was the one that mattered. She thought about the layout. 3-man infiltration, 2 running the sweep. The third would be static, holding a choke point, waiting for the others to flush the target toward him. The main staircase, which she had just come from. She moved toward the gallery. The upper level of the study was accessible from the east corridor through a door she had tested on day 2 and confirmed opened on well-maintained hinges. From the gallery, she could see the full study floor and both entry points and hold the elevation advantage, which in a 3-on-1 situation, with incomplete information, was the only advantage worth having. She reached the gallery door, opened it. 6 inches slipped through. Below, a man entered the study from the main door. 6 feet. Dark tactical gear. Suppressed pistol. At low ready. He moved with the contained efficiency of someone trained and experienced. His head was on a slow, methodical swivel. He was very good. She could tell from the economy of his movement the absence of wasted energy. He was not underestimating the situation. But he had not looked up. A second man entered from the side corridor. Smaller, quicker, younger, with an edge of adrenaline the first man did not have. He signaled with 2 fingers pointed upward. The first man shook his head and pointed toward the kitchen. They thought they were still clearing the lower level. They had not accounted for the gallery. She had 90 seconds before they finished the lower sweep and moved upstairs. Upstairs was where they believed the target was. Upstairs was where she would lose every advantage she currently held. She thought about the layout. If she were running this infiltration, where did she put the third man? Not in the sweep. Static. Holding the choke point. Watching the primary staircase. Which meant he was between her and the gallery door positioned facing down toward the entry hall, rather than up the corridor, and she had walked past him in the dark, without either of them knowing the other was there. She went back along the gallery to the door, opened it the same measured 6 inches, listened. Below her eye line, the staircase landing was down a half flight from the gallery door. She could hear the slight rhythm of measured breathing and the faint shift of weight. A man who was good at being still, but not quite still enough for someone who had been trained to listen for exactly this. She thought about her father's voice. You do not engage on their terms. You change the terms. She opened the door fully and stepped into the corridor. He heard her. They always heard at close range when they were any good. He started to turn. She was already moving. What happened in the next 8 seconds did not feel like anything she had words for. It was not heroic, and it was not elegant, and it was not violence the way violence looks when someone performs it for an audience. It was mechanical and fast, and it ended with a man unconscious at the base of the half staircase and a zip tie from her cargo pocket around his wrists, and his weapon cleared and emptied on the landing step. She took his radio. Downstairs, the 2 men were moving toward the kitchen, which bought her 40 seconds. She went the other direction. The utility corridor ran along the north exterior wall service access, for the mechanical systems barely wide enough for one person connecting the main structure to the equipment building at the rear. Stellan had shown it to her on the first walkthrough. The equipment building had 3 things she needed: a secondary radio on a hardened frequency, an emergency vehicle in the maintenance bay, and the main breaker panel for the compound's hardwired security system, which ran on a separate circuit from the primary power grid. If she could restore that circuit, the exterior cameras would come back online. She moved through the corridor with the cold hitting her in sustained waves, her breath coming out in short, visible clouds that she controlled consciously, deliberately, without permission to do otherwise. She reached the equipment building door and tried the handle. Locked from the inside. She stood with this for 2 seconds. Someone had locked it from inside, which meant either it had defaulted to locked when the power cut possible as a security feature, or someone was already in there. She put her ear against the door and listened. Breathing. Slow and shallow and not right. Not the breathing of someone conscious and waiting. The breathing of someone who was hurt and managing it. She knocked 3 times. Quiet. The compound's internal signal she had heard Hatch use the first morning. 4 seconds. Then a dragging sound. A lock turning with difficulty. The door opened 6 inches and Hatch Reiser's face appeared in the gap, white as the snow outside, with a wound above his left ear that had bled down the side of his neck and dried dark. His eyes found her and sharpened from the blurred distance of someone fighting concussion. "Can you walk?" she said. "Yes, I can walk." "Good. I need the security circuit restored. Breaker panel." He pushed the door open and moved aside to let her in. He put his hand against the wall once, and then took it off and stood on his own. The specific stubbornness of a man who understood this was not the time to be as injured as he was. "2 of my men are down outside," he said. "Breaker panel first. Tell me about outside after we have eyes back." He moved to the panel. His hands were deliberate and careful. She watched the angles while he worked. Both windows, the interior door, the gap under the equipment bay door. "There are 3 of them," she said. "One is zip-tied on the east stair landing. 2 are in the main building, probably heading upstairs now." He looked at her over his shoulder with a look that was revising something significant about his earlier assessment of the situation. "They think I am upstairs," she said. They were briefed that the primary target would be in the master suite on the north side. Who had the security holding positions in the plan? His jaw set. 6 people, 4 of my men, and 2 others. She waited. He did not answer, which was its own answer. A click, then another. The lights in the equipment building flickered and came on at half power, the emergency setting. Somewhere in the main building she heard the same restoration happen, a faint change in the quality of the dark, visible through the high window. The lights coming back would tell the 2 men upstairs that something had changed, that the darkness they had relied on was compromised, that whoever they were hunting was not where they thought she was. It would also tell them that someone had interfered with their operation, and men who understood their plan had been compromised, made different choices than men who believed they were on schedule. "Weapon," she said to Hatch. He reached under the workbench and produced a compact shotgun she had not known was there. He held it out toward her. "I can work the panel," he said. "I cannot clear a building right now." She took the shotgun. "Stellan," she said. "His summit. Do you have a secondary contact for his security detail?" "Yes." "Use it now. Whatever is happening at that summit, I think it is connected to this. I think the compound and the summit are 2 tracks of the same operation." He was already on the radio. She watched him key the secondary frequency, his hands steady despite everything. And she thought about how much she was going to trust that call, and what the odds were that it would reach the right person. She moved back toward the utility corridor door. She stopped with her hand on the frame and looked back at him. "Lock this behind me," she said. "Do not open it for anyone except me or Stellan." He looked at her with the recalibrated expression, the one that had been shifting since she appeared at his door. Something in it had changed from the first day when he shook her hand too carefully. "Mrs. Vore," he said, "there are 2 professional contractors in that building. I know what they are." She went back into the corridor. The cold hit her like a flat palm, and she walked into it without slowing the shotgun low. Her breathing steady, everything that was not immediately relevant going very quiet under the familiar compression of self that happened when the situation required it. She had spent 11 years building a life that looked nothing like what her father had made of her. And she had spent 11 years carrying what he had made of her in a locked case at the back of a closet. She was not going to examine tonight what that meant about her. There was not time. There was only the corridor and the next decision and the door at the end. She reached the interior door, stopped, listened. Upstairs, something fell. A door opened hard. A voice clipped and controlled, but with an edge in it that had not been there before, which meant the restoration of the security circuit had done exactly what she had intended it to do. "She is not up here." A pause. "Check the north corridor." She had to have. And then she heard a third voice that was not from the radio, a voice from directly on the other side of the door in front of her. Close. Certain. "She is not upstairs," the voice said, "because she is not an amateur." The door opened from the other side. The man standing in the frame was not one of the contractors. She recognized him, not from the compound, from a charity dinner in October, standing at the edge of a conversation she had not been invited to with a glass of whiskey, and the particular stillness of a man who was always in the room on someone else's behalf. Briggs Olin, Stellan's head of external operations, third in the organizational structure behind Stellan and Aldous Fenn, the man who had access to the security plan. The man who had been in every operational briefing for the last 14 months. He looked at her with the flat professional attention of someone who had already made every necessary decision and was simply waiting for the situation to catch up. "Put it down," he said. She looked at him, at his hands. The right one near his hip where a shoulder rig would sit under his jacket. At the corridor behind him, which was empty. At the distance between them, which was 8 feet. At the geometry of the doorframe and the angle of the light and the specific weight of what she was holding and what she knew. She thought about Stellan on a road heading toward a summit that Briggs had known for 14 months was a trap. "Briggs," she said, "you are going to want to think very carefully about what comes next." His hand moved toward his hip. She was already moving, not toward him, sideways into the door frame itself, using the metal edge as a partial barrier and dropping her shoulder so the first shot, suppressed and flat and mechanical, went into the corridor wall at the height where her sternum had been a quarter second earlier. She felt the displaced air of it against her neck. That close. She came back around the frame low and drove the shotgun stock into his forearm before he could adjust his angle. Not a clean hit. She caught the meat of his forearm rather than the wrist she had aimed for, but enough. His grip broke. The pistol clattered to the concrete floor and skidded toward the wall. Briggs. Olin was not small and he was not slow, and he came at her with the compact, controlled aggression of someone who had trained for close quarters and knew exactly how to use his size. For 3 seconds, the corridor was a very ugly place. She took an elbow across the left side of her jaw that sent white across the edges of her vision and drove her into the wall. She went with it instead of against it. Her father's voice, "Do not resist the impact. Use it." She used the wall to push back, got under his reach, drove her knee into his thigh, because the angle was not right for the target she actually wanted. He grabbed her shoulder with a grip that was powerful and certain. She let him have it and used the pull to free her right hand. She hit him in the throat with 2 fingers. Not enough to crush the larynx. Enough to interrupt his breathing for 3 seconds. She got behind him. She got the knife out. "Stop," she said. He stopped. He was breathing with the careful elevation of someone whose throat has been struck. His hands moved away from his body. The training in him recognized the geometry. She was behind him. She had the knife, and the floor was the only available destination. "Floor," she said. He went down slowly. She put her knee into the center of his back and her weight into it. "The summit," she said. "Talk." A long second. "Talk." "Sayre made an offer," he said. His voice was flat and controlled, even pressed against the floor. 14 months ago. What kind of offer? The kind you do not say no to and stay alive. She thought about 14 months ago. Before she had walked into the Vore Holdings lobby. Before the marriage. Before she had built herself into the architecture of Stellan's operation. The offer had come before her, which meant Briggs Olin had been a Sayre asset for the entire time she had known him. Every meeting, every briefing, every conversation in which operational details had been discussed while he sat at the table. The scale of it settled in her chest like something swallowed. "The summit," she said again. "Staging ground. They used the Northern Commission format, called it an emergency session, ran it through Dellum's office so it would look legitimate. Stellan goes there. There is no meeting." He paused. 6 men. Maybe more by now. Location. She increased the pressure on his back and he exhaled hard through his nose. Whitmore Lodge, Route 73. 30 minutes north. She absorbed this. 30 minutes north. Stellan had been on the road for 90 minutes, which meant he was already there. Hatch had called the secondary contact 7 minutes ago. She thought about what Briggs had said. How many of Stellan's detail knew? How many, she said? 2. Reardon and Falco. His primary drivers tonight. The weight in her chest got heavier. Stellan had driven into that staging ground with his own people in the front seats. And if Hatch's call had reached anyone, it had reached a number that routed through Reardon or Falco. And if that was true, the warning had gone nowhere useful. She stood up. She picked up his weapon from the floor and cleared the chamber. "Your 2 contractors upstairs," she said. "They will stand down. They are paid contractors, not soldiers. If you have already dropped one of them, they know the job has gone wrong." "That is not what I asked." He rolled over and looked up at her from the floor. His face had the expression of a man who had run all the numbers and arrived at an answer he did not like. Not fear, exactly. The specific exhaustion of someone who has been carrying something too heavy for too long and has just set it down in the worst possible way. "Main corridor," he said. "Second floor. They will be reassessing." She thought about the layout. Second floor, main corridor was the defensive position anyone with training would take after a plan started degrading. From there, they could control access to the upper level and wait for direction from Briggs that was not coming. "Get up," she said. He looked at the knife and then at her face and got up. "You are going to walk in front of me into the main building, and you are going to call them off. Both of them. And if either of them moves in a direction I do not expect, I will make a decision about you that you will not have time to argue with." "Yes," he said. They went through the utility corridor together. Briggs in front, her 2 steps behind. The cold was the same, but it felt external now. Something happening on the other side of her skin while the interior was very quiet and very focused. She registered the pain in her jaw where the elbow had caught her. She filed it. She registered the throb beginning in her left shoulder from the earlier impact. She filed that too. They came back through into the main building. The lights at emergency half-power stripped the mountain warmth out of the house and made it look exactly like what it currently was. Briggs found the staircase. Called up. "Stand down. Job is burned. Come out with hands visible." 30 seconds of silence. Then, confirmed. 2 men appeared at the top of the stairs with their hands clear of their bodies, moving with the practiced neutrality of professionals who understood when an operation was finished. Neither of them looked happy. Neither of them looked like they were going to complicate things further. "Weapons on the floor," she said. "Kick them to the wall." They did it without argument. "Sit down at the top of the stairs. Do not move." They sat. She looked at Briggs. He was looking at her with the worn-down calculation of a man whose options had reduced to a single point. Then he said something she had not expected. "I can help," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. "Why?" "Because I have been doing Sayer's work for 14 months. And I know what he will do with what is in your hand." He met her eyes without looking away. "And because Stellan trusted me for 6 years before that. And I'm going to have to live with what I did regardless of what happens tonight." He paused. "I would rather live with it having done one right thing at the end." She looked at him. She thought about the shape of this night and the choice she had made in a lobby 11 months ago, walking through a door every rational instinct said to avoid. She handed him one of the contractor weapons from the wall. "If you point that at anything except what I tell you to," she said, "I will not give you the 2 seconds you would need to explain yourself." "Understood." She turned back to the security monitors. She studied the driveway and the approaches and the angles from the upper windows. and the equipment building and the tree line where the motion sensors would catch movement first. 8 people were coming through that tree line with instructions to take her alive. Coming to take someone alive required restraint, required hesitation at the critical moment, required managing outcomes that a kill order did not require managing. She had no such restriction. "Get Hatch on the radio," she said to Briggs. "Tell him to stay in the equipment building and keep the security circuit active, regardless of what he hears." She paused. "And tell him he is going to hear things." What happened in the next 17 minutes was not something Nora would ever describe to anyone in full. Not because she could not find the words. She had always been precise with language. The same precision she brought to numbers, the same refusal to let imprecision stand where accuracy was available. She did not describe it because some things are accurate in the experiencing and lose something essential in the telling. The way a financial model can be technically correct and still fail to capture what the numbers actually mean when they land on a human life. She used all 17 minutes. The compound's architecture had been in her head since day 2, not as a place she was living in, but as a problem she had already solved. Entry points, choke points, elevation advantages, blind spots. The specific geometry of what you could see from where and what you could not. Her father had required this of every building she entered from the age of 10 onward, a habit that had felt like paranoia in her adult life until the night it felt like the only sane thing she had ever done. She gave Briggs the north window and the east approach. She took the west exposure and the study and the entry hall. The 2 contractors at the top of the stairs she sent to the utility corridor exit with instructions simple enough that there was no room for interpretation. Anyone through that door who was not her or Briggs or an older man with a head wound, they stopped. She did not specify how. They did not ask. The overwatch at the northeast tree line she handled from the study window. With the rifle she took from Stellan's weapons locker, cracking the glass 2 inches to let in a blade of Arctic air that cut straight to the bone, finding the specific dark shape against dark, in the scope accounting for the wind that her father had never accepted as an excuse. The shot broke cleanly. She was already moving before she needed to confirm it. The West team came through the side door with a mechanical bypass on the external panel, quiet and professional. And she was waiting on the wrong side of the door's arc when the first man came through scanning left. She did not let him correct. The second man was better faster and found her immediately. And the next 30 seconds in the narrow hallway were the kind of 30 seconds that do not have a grammar for polite description. She took a hit across her left shoulder from an elbow she had not fully slipped. It went deep into the muscle with the specific quality of an impact that does not register as pain immediately, but is made a reservation for later. She filed it and kept moving. When it was done, she stood in the west corridor with her back against the wall, and her hands braced, and the cold from the open door coming in. And she let it come because cold was useful right now. And she breathed until her pulse came down to something she could work with. 2 down. Radio confirmed Briggs had handled 1 on the east approach. The contractors in the utility corridor had dealt with 2 more based on the sounds she had heard from that direction, and then the silence that followed. That left 2 unaccounted for by her count, and she had learned from the first hour of this night not to trust any count in a situation like this, because the number that killed you was always the one you decided was not there. She went back to the security monitor. 2 motion signatures on the north face, approaching the main entrance. She got to the entry hall before they did. The main door opened. The first man through was the largest of the night. He swept the room and found her immediately, which she respected. And he stopped. Behind him, a second figure, smaller, older dressed, not for tactical operations, but for a business meeting. a dark coat wet from the snow with the particular stillness of a man who was not here to do the physical work, but to observe the outcome. She had never seen his face before. She had seen his name on 47 documents over 11 weeks of work attached to shell companies and offshore accounts and financial instruments that moved dirty money through legitimate structures with the elegance of someone who had been doing it for 3 decades. He looked at her. She looked at him. The entry hall was very quiet. "You must be Nora," he said. "Franklin," she said. Franklin Sayre was 68 years old and looked it in the way that certain kinds of men look their age, not diminished by it, but carrying it the specific density of a face that has absorbed 3 decades of decisions that would have destroyed a softer material. He looked around the entry hall. He looked at what the last 17 minutes had left behind. His expression did not change, except in one small way around the eyes. A calculation completing itself. "Where are my people?" he said. "Detained. The ones who can still be detained." He absorbed this the way he absorbed everything without visible reaction, the information simply entering and being processed. "You are not what I was told to expect," he said. "People rarely are." The large man beside him had not moved. He was watching her with the focused attention of someone waiting for instruction. His weapon at low ready. She was watching him with the same attention in return. They both understood the geometry. At this distance, neither of them could miss. And the question of who moved first was the only question that mattered. "I am not here to harm you," Sayre said. His voice was the voice of a man who said things once and did not repeat them. "I know what you are here for. Then you know it is a reasonable offer." He looked at the hall around him and then back at her. "You have seen what Stellan has built, and you have been the engine of half of it for the past year. You know what that mind of yours is worth to the right organization." She looked at him. "I am offering full partnership," he said. "The documentation you have built used the way it should be used. Not as Stellan's private leverage, but as a tool for restructuring the entire commission architecture. You would have a seat, not a role, a seat." "And Stellan," she said. Something in Sayre's face settled into a different configuration. Not regret. The expression of a man stating a logistical fact. "Stellan is a problem that resolves itself once you are no longer beside him." The entry hall was very cold. The main door was still open behind Sayre, and the snow was coming through it in slow drifting currents that moved across the stone floor and dissolved. She thought about Stellan on Route 28. She thought about Rourke-Delham, and whether that call had reached the right people. She thought about the transfer drive in her jacket pocket with 47 files and 312 pages of work. She thought about what her father had said about the moment of decision. Not the large one, the small one inside it. The one that was actually you. The large man beside Sayre shifted his weight. Just his weight, not his weapon. A millimeter of movement that could have been nothing and was not nothing. The preliminary adjustment of a man whose next action was already decided and was waiting for the signal. Her father had taught her to see that too. She fired before the signal came, not at the large man, at the light fixture above him because a dead man in front of Franklin Sayre. With his instructions still pending was a negotiating problem she could not afford, and she still needed 30 seconds of conversation. The shot blew the fixture and the entry hall dropped into the flat gray wash of snowlight through the open door. She moved left hard, using the stairs as cover. "Tell him to stand down," she said into the dark, "or the next one is not the light." Silence. Snow moving through the open door. Then Sayre's voice. Controlled. "Stand down." The large man's silhouette went still. She came around the base of the stairs with the handgun up, stopped at a distance that was close enough for precision and far enough not to be grabbed. And she looked at Franklin Sayre in the snow-gray dark of the entry hall. "Here is what happens," she said. Her voice was steady. She was aware of her shoulder, which had moved from filed pain to active pain in the last several minutes, and of her jaw, and of the specific kind of exhaustion that meant the adrenaline was finite, and she was burning through the reserve. "You are going to sit down in that chair." She gestured with her free hand toward the bench by the entry wall. "You are going to call off whatever you have on Route 28. And then you are going to wait." "Wait for what?" "For Stellan." Sayre looked at her for a long moment. In his eyes, behind the control and the calculation, was something she had not expected to see. Not fear. Something more complicated. The look of a man who has fundamentally miscalculated something and is still in the process of understanding the exact nature of the error. He will not be coming for at least. He is 25 minutes out. "At most," she said. "Call off Route 28, now." He looked at her, at the handgun, at the dark hall around him and the absence of his people. He pulled his phone. She listened to him make the call. She watched his face while he made it, watching for the quality of the words and the register of the voice and the things people cannot control when they are delivering false information. He was very good. She caught one thing, a pause after the instruction that was slightly too long. The pause of a man leaving space for a question he expected that did not come. She did not know if the call was genuine. She would not know until Stellan arrived. Sayre sat down on this bench. She stood in the dark entry hall with the gun level and the snow blowing in through the open door, and the full weight of the last 2 hours beginning to call in its debt from her body. She did not lower the weapon. She did not let herself think about what had happened on Route 28 before Hatch's call reached whoever it needed to reach. She breathed in through the nose and out through the mouth, and she waited. Sayre looked at her from the bench. He said quietly with the tone of a man revising a professional assessment, "He does not know what you are, does he?" She did not answer. "He knows you are capable," Sayre said. "But this." He looked at the hall around them, at what the evidence of the last 2 hours amounted to. "He does not know about this." "You are wrong," she said. And from the open doorway behind Sayre, cutting through the snow and the dark, came the hard white sweep of headlights, turning off the road onto the compound drive, and the sound of engines. And then a voice she knew calling her name in a register. She had never heard from him before. Not controlled. Not measured. The raw, unperformed voice of a man who had been 25 minutes from something he could not afford to lose, and had driven every one of those minutes knowing it. She did not lower the gun, but she let herself breathe. Stellan came through the door with snow on his shoulders and a weapon in his hand, and his eyes found her before anything else in the room. She was still in the same position, gun up, shoulder burning. The entry hall around her was cold and dark and smelled of gunpowder and wet stone, and the sharp, particular odor of a night that had gone too far in too many directions. He looked at her. He looked at the hall. He looked at Sayre on the bench. Something moved through his expression that she did not have a name for and did not reach for one. "I am all right," she said before he could ask. Her voice came out steady, which she was grateful for because the rest of her was having a more complicated response to him being in the room. "Hatch is in the equipment building. Head wound but mobile. The east stair landing has a man zip-tied. West corridor has 2 more. Briggs handled one on the east approach. Ask the contractors about the utility corridor. She paused. Overwatch at the northeast tree line is down. 1. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he walked toward her. She lowered the gun when he was close enough that keeping it up would have been its own kind of statement. He put his hand on the side of her face, the right side, not the left, where the swelling was, which told her he had already seen it. He looked at her the way people look at things they almost lost and are still in the process of understanding the almost. She let him look. Then he dropped his hand and turned to face Sayre, and the quality of him changed completely. Sayre had not moved from the bench. He sat with his coat still wet from the snow, and his hands visible in his lap, and the expression of a man who had made his last large calculation of the night and arrived at the only available conclusion. "You should have sent more," Stellan said. "I sent enough for what I thought I was dealing with." Sayre looked briefly at Nora and then back. "I was misinformed about the situation." "You were misinformed about my wife." Sayre said nothing. Stellan pulled a chair from against the wall and set it in front of Sayre, and sat down in it. The geometry had a deliberate quality. She recognized two men negotiating in a world where negotiation happened at gunpoint, and everyone present understood the actual terms. Briggs, Olin, Stellan said, "Yes." Reardon and Falco, "Yes." "How long?" Reardon and Falco, 8 months. Briggs, 14. Stellan absorbed this without visible reaction. She watched the muscles along his jaw do something small and controlled, and then stop. She thought about what 14 months meant in the architecture of everything Stellan had trusted Briggs with. Every conversation, every operational detail. Every morning Briggs had chosen to sit across the table and continue. He looked at Nora. She told him plainly. No advocacy in either direction. What Briggs had done and the decision he had made at the end of it, and what that decision had cost him to make, and what it had meant in practical terms for the outcome of the night. Stellan listened. When she finished, he looked at the floor for a moment. "He made a choice," she said. At the end, "I am not telling you it balances. I am telling you what happened." He held her eyes for a moment. Then he looked back at Sayre. "The documentation," Stellan said. "What you have. A partial copy. 8 weeks of your wife's work." Sayre's voice was even. "The final mapping is on a drive that is not in my possession." He paused. "I am not going to pretend I have significant leverage here. I am telling you the relevant facts. When does the contingency trigger?" 48 hours from my departure from Chicago. Nora did the calculation without being asked. 31 hours from now, give or take. Stellan nodded once. He stood from the chair and looked at Sayre for a long moment. The final kind of look. Then he said, "I am going to make a call. You are going to sit there until I come back. You move from that bench and my wife will make a decision about you that I will not argue with." He walked toward the back of the house. Nora stayed where she was. Sayre looked at her. She looked at him. The snow was still coming through the open door, and neither of them moved to close it, as if closing it would require a kind of normalcy that neither of them could access right now. "The offer I made you," Sayre said. "I want you to understand it was genuine." "I understood it was genuine," she said. "That is not the same as it being acceptable. Most people in your position would weigh it differently. I am not in a position." She kept her voice level. "I am in a marriage. There is a difference." He looked at her with the dense, weathered quality his face had. "You know what this world does to people who love things in it. I know what it does to people who do not," she said. He was quiet. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "The partial copy. Your financial director. Give me his contact information. Sayre looked at her. Not for Stellan, she said. For me. I'm going to call him and I'm going to explain what the complete documentation contains and what happens to every financial instrument connected to your organization when I finish it and file it with the appropriate people. And your financial director is going to make a rational decision about contingency instructions that no longer serve anyone's interests. She held his eyes. Or Stellan makes the call and it goes differently. A long silence. Sayre reached into his coat pocket. He produced a card and held it out. She crossed the distance and took it without looking away from his face. She went to the security room and made the call, standing in the flat emergency light with the monitor still running its six-way split of exterior cameras and Hatch's dried blood on the edge of the chair. The call took 11 minutes. She did not threaten. She did not perform anything. She laid out the financial reality of the situation with the same precise clarity she brought to every audit engagement. Here is what exists. Here is what it means. Here is the logical outcome of each available choice. She answered 2 questions. She waited while the man on the other end made his decision. He made the right one. She came back to the entry hall and told Stellan. He was there with 2 of his men and Briggs Olin, who was standing near the foot of the stairs with his hands at his sides, and the settled expression of a man waiting for a verdict he has already accepted. Stellan looked at Briggs for a long time. Briggs looked back. He did not perform anything. No manufactured remorse. No posturing. Just the honest, exhausted face of a man who had done a wrong thing for a long time and had spent one night trying to partially correct it and understood exactly how that arithmetic worked out. 14 months, Stellan said. Yes. What did you give them? What did? Briggs went through it. All of it. Every communication, every file transfer, every operational briefing he had passed to Sayre's organization over 14 months. He was thorough and specific and did not minimize or contextualize. Nora watched Stellan's face during this and watched the way it did not change externally, while something behind it absorbed impact after impact with the quiet devastation of a structure taking on damage it cannot immediately express. When Briggs finished, Stellan was quiet for a moment. Why are you still alive? He said. Not a threat. A genuine question. Because your wife made a tactical decision and I made a different kind of decision, and we both got through the next 20 minutes. Briggs paused. She will tell you what I did or did not do. I am not going to argue my own case. Stellan looked at Nora. She told him, plainly without advocacy in either direction, what had happened, and what Briggs had done at the end of it, and what it had cost him to make that choice. When she finished, Stellan looked at the floor for a moment, then back at Briggs. You are done, he said. You understand what that means? Yes. Not tonight. Tonight you sit with my people and you give them everything. Every contact, every communication, every instruction you received, all of it. Yes. Then you are done. Briggs nodded once. 2 of Stellan's men took him toward the back of the house and he went without resistance. That was the last time Nora saw Briggs Olin. She thought about him occasionally in the weeks that followed, not with anger, with something more complicated that she did not try to name. The next 6 hours were the mechanical aftermath of a night that had been too many things at once. Accounting for everyone, securing the compound, managing the information about what had happened, and who knew what, and what version of events would be given to the people who required a version. Hatch came out of the equipment building and refused to go to the hospital until Stellan told him directly that refusal was not an option. 2 of his exterior men were alive and concussed. A third had been airlifted out before dawn. She did not learn his name until the following week, and she thought about the anonymity of the people on the edges of nights like this, the ones who carry the weight of other people's wars in their bodies. The two contractors walked out of the compound at 4 in the morning and disappeared into the dissipating storm. She did not know their names, and they did not know hers. And that was the arrangement, and it held. Franklin Sayre left in the back of one of Stellan's vehicles under circumstances she was not present for, and did not ask about in detail. What she knew was that by the following Thursday, the Chicago underworld had received specific and credible information about the financial condition of the Sayre organization, not from the complete documentation, which she had not released, but from a targeted excerpt she had chosen herself, precisely selected to demonstrate to every family with money connected to Sayre's network that the exposure risk of continued association was catastrophically high. She had chosen the excerpt herself. Stellan had asked her what she needed to release to achieve the structural outcome without burning everything, and she had sat with the documentation for 3 hours and made surgical choices the way she made every financial decision, with the understanding that the goal was not maximum damage but precise leverage, and that precision in this context meant knowing which stone to remove from the foundation to bring the whole thing down without needing to control the collapse. She was very good at knowing which stone. By the following Tuesday, the Sayre organization had lost 11 of its 14 senior lieutenants to defection, negotiated departure, or the specific kind of voluntary disappearance that happened when men understood the walls were coming in. Where Franklin Sayre himself was by that Tuesday, she did not have specific knowledge, and Stellan did not offer the information, and she made a choice not to ask. Some knowledge was not her department. She had understood that from the beginning, standing in that lobby on Michigan Avenue, and she understood it still. 3 weeks after the Adirondack night, Stellan came home to the Chicago apartment at 11 in the evening and found her at the kitchen table with the complete documentation spread across it, not working against a deadline, just working the way she always worked, with the methodical absorption of someone who found the architecture of hidden things genuinely interesting. He stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her. She looked up. "It is done," she said. "The complete mapping. All 47 files. Fully sourced, cross-referenced, commission-ready." He came to the table and sat across from her, and looked at the pages she turned toward him. He read the way she had come to know over a year of conference tables, carefully line by line, with the attention of someone who understood what they were reading. She watched his face as he went through it, and she thought about the first time she had watched him read in that conference room at the top of the Michigan Avenue building, and the exhaustion in his eyes. Then that was different now. Not gone, but different in quality. The exhaustion of a man who had set something down rather than one still carrying it. This is everything he said. Everything traceable from the inside. There are offshore structures deep enough that I would need a different kind of access to map them fully. But everything reachable from within the network is there. What do you want to do with it? She looked at the pages. She thought about what Sayre had said in the entry hall, used the way it should be used. She thought about the specific way she disagreed with him and the specific way she did not. "Keep it," she said. "Not as leverage. Leverage degrades the moment you use it." She looked at Stellan. Whoever tries to rebuild what Sayre had, they will do it using the same financial structures, because those structures work, and people repeat what works. When they do, this map will tell you exactly where to look. He looked at the pages again. Then he looked at her. "An early warning system," he said, "built into the foundation." Yes, the kitchen was warm in a way the compound had not been, and the city moved outside the windows with its ordinary indifferent noise. He reached across the table and took the page from her hand and set it face down on the stack. and the things they had both been not quite saying for a year were in the room with them now. Not needing to be said, simply present the way a thing is present, when it has been true long enough to stop requiring acknowledgement. He put his hand over hers on the table. She did not file it. She did not set it aside for later examination. She left it exactly where it was. The Winter Gala was in February, 6 weeks after the Adirondack Night, at the same Art Institute venue, where Sylvia Raft had made her comment about Nora's dress the previous October. Nora wore navy. She had not chosen it for any reason except that she liked the color, and it was cold outside, which was exactly the kind of reason she had always chosen clothes before the world decided her choices were symbolic. She arrived with Stellan at 8, and the room was the same room, the same columns, the same catering staff moving through with the same practiced efficiency, the same clusters of expensive people performing their expensive relationships at each other. What was different was the way it stopped when she walked in, not completely, not dramatically. Subtler than that, and subtler things were always more real. A pause in conversation here, a redirected glance there, the particular quality of attention from people who have received and processed specific information and are now recalibrating their behavior in response to it. Sylvia Raft was near the east window. She saw Nora across the room and looked away, not with the casual dismissal of October, with the careful deliberateness of someone who has decided that looking away is the correct strategic choice. That was the difference. In October, Sylvia Raft had looked away because Nora was not worth looking at. In February, she looked away because looking was a risk she did not want to take. Nora went to the bar and ordered a club soda. She was always working at these events, reading the room for the things rooms contained under their surfaces. A woman she did not know approached her, mid-40s, precise and self-possessed, the wife of a Northern Commission family lieutenant she knew by name, but had not previously spoken with. "Mrs. Vore," the woman said, "I am Margot Quell, my husband." "I know who your husband is," Nora said, not unkindly, just directly. Margot Quell looked at her for a moment and then smiled. A real smile, not the social instrument of the previous year's events. "I wanted to introduce myself properly. We have not had the opportunity." "No," Nora said. "We have not." They talked for 20 minutes. About Chicago. About the Commission's shifting structure in the weeks since the SARE organization had begun its collapse. About a real estate development the Quell family was involved in that had a financial modeling problem. Nora identified within 4 minutes of hearing it described. Margot listened and asked good questions and looked at her with the attention of someone taking notes. When she left, she said she hoped they could speak again soon. "I expect we will," Nora said. Patrick Dorr was across the room near the bar. He looked in her direction once, then looked deliberately at the floor. Not hostility. Acknowledgement. The specific acknowledgement of a man who has made a new assessment and is communicating it through the only channel available to him without losing face. She noted it, filed it, moved on. Stellan found her near the windows an hour into the evening. He stood beside her in the way they stood together in public close, but not performing closeness, which was its own kind of statement, in a room that was always watching. "Dellum wants a meeting," he said quietly. "He has been asking through 3 different channels." "I know." She looked across the room. "I have been making him ask through 3 different channels because I wanted to finish the documentation first. Schedule it for Thursday. I will be in the room." He was quiet for a moment. "He will expect me to bring Aldous. He will get me instead. Aldous is better at legal structure than commission politics. Thursday's meeting is commission politics." She paused. "Unless you would prefer to handle it without me." Stellan looked at her with the expression she had learned over a year to read. The one that contained something like amusement, and something else that was not amusement at all. "No," he said. She nodded. She looked back out at the room, at the people moving through it. The careful hierarchies and alliances and rivalries all performing their ongoing negotiations through posture and proximity, and the grammar of who spoke to whom and for how long. She had spent a year learning to read this room. She expected to spend more years yet because the room was never finished. It was a living document, and living documents required constant re-examination. She was very good at living documents. Stellan's hand came to the small of her back lightly, the way he touched her in public, a communication rather than a possession. She felt the warmth of it through the fabric. She thought about the entry hall and standing in the dark with the gun up and the snow blowing in, and his voice coming through the door, and the specific way her body had responded. Not relief exactly, something more complicated, something that understood the difference between rescue and arrival, and recognized that what had come through that door was the second one. "I need to talk to you about the Delham meeting structure," she said. "Now. Better now than Thursday with no preparation." She glanced at him. "Unless you would rather enjoy the party." He made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "I have never enjoyed a party in my life," he said. "Neither have I," she said, and they stood together in the room that had once decided she was a mistake. And she told him what she thought about the meeting structure, and he listened the way he always listened, completely, with the full attention of someone who understood the difference between hearing and considering. The room moved around them and adjusted to them the way rooms adjust around gravity, without announcement, without drama, simply as a matter of physics. When the evening ended, they walked out through the tall museum doors into the February cold. Stellan's coat opened because he never felt the cold the way other people felt it. She had noted this early and filed it under things that were inexplicably characteristic of him, and that she had stopped trying to explain. She pulled her own coat closer and looked up at the sky above the city. The particular orange-black of a winter city sky, cloudlit and opaque, with no stars visible, and the cold coming off the lake in long, flat waves. She thought about Montana in winter, about stars you could actually see. Too many of them. The sky there genuinely dark, the way city skies never were. She thought about her father standing in that darkness, teaching her to read it, to find position in it, to use it, rather than fear it. She thought, "I do not fear this." She thought, "I never did." The car came and they got in, and the city moved past the windows, and Stellan said nothing and she said nothing, and the silence between them was the kind that had earned itself over a year of everything it had been through, and it held them both in it like something solid. 3 months after the February gala at a commission dinner on the north side of the city, Nora arrived slightly ahead of schedule and found herself outside the closed door of the main room. The conversation inside was audible through the door, not loudly but clearly enough. She stood there for a moment, listening before she was ready to announce herself. She heard her name. She heard what came before it and after it. A complete sentence spoken by a man whose voice she recognized as one of the older Northern Commission lieutenants, delivered in the tone of a man stating something that had moved from opinion into established fact. The shipbreaker queen. She stood outside the door. She was not surprised. She had felt the name gathering for weeks, in the way certain kinds of information gather, accumulating in the spaces between conversations, in the quality of attention, in rooms, in the specific way people did not quite meet her eyes, and then did. She had known something like this was coming the way she knew most things, by following the pattern, until it resolved into a shape she could name. She stood there for one more second, not because she needed to compose herself, because she wanted that second. 1 second that was hers alone before she walked in and it became something else. before it became the room's understanding of her, rather than her own. She had spent her entire adult life being not quite seen, being the last person anyone expected to have the sharpest number in the room, being the woman at the gala that Sylvia Raft felt entitled to reduce to a comment about a dress. She had spent 11 years building a careful, controlled, ordinary life over the top of what her father had built in her. And she had done it well. And she had been good at it. And it had never quite fit the way she had needed it to fit. She was not that woman anymore. She was not sure she had ever entirely been that woman. She had simply been waiting without knowing what she was waiting for the question that required the actual answer. The question had arrived 11 months ago, in the form of a spreadsheet, and a glazed donut, and a choice between going home and going somewhere that every rational instinct said to avoid. She had not gone home. She filed the name the way she filed everything, with the quiet, methodical attention of someone who understood that information was always worth having, and that the most important information was usually the kind that arrived when people forgot you were listening. She had always been very good at being present in rooms where people forgot she was listening. She looked at the door. She put her hand on the handle. She walked in.